This is Anastasia Lee with CombatACE.com. Today we're interviewing Kim Crow, the first woman to have her voice digitized. She's the original Bitchin' Betty for a number of aircraft, including some of the first space shuttles launched by NASA. Miss Crow also received an Emmy nomination for her role in Echoes of the Holocaust. It's a great honor to do this interview with her, and I hope all of you will enjoy hearing her amazing tale. To get started, what inspired you to become a voice actress?
I made a decision in 8th grade to be an actor because I thought it would be the hardest thing I could be. You'd have to be, if you were portraying a secretary, you'd have to know all secretarial skills. If you were a detective, you'd have to know how to analyze clues and be proficient in criminology. So I had this great expectation for a career. And that's primarily because my father was a rocket engineer and my mother was basically a psychic social worker, but literally. So I was raised in an atmosphere that said you can be anything or do anything. And you must give as much as you receive, if not more.
Interesting. So, what were some of the events that led up to you becoming the first woman to have her voice digitized?
To be an actor was, I thought, the hardest thing I could be. I started really getting the bug. First I chose acting, then acting chose me. This happened through high school, and later, of course, intensively training at Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. as one of Father Hartke's kids. And then also having a sabbatical from Catholic U and training with Robin Barbary of RADA and taking other courses at the University of London. Now, an actor's tools are voice, body, and imagination. So being a voice actress, I thought, was part and parcel with being a film actress, a stage actress. There was never any segregation. Way back when, in prehistory, we had wonderful things like government intervention in the arts that would help support you. One of those things was called a CETA grant, Comprehensive Educational Training Act, which was actually, I think, signed into law by President Nixon, but it was Jimmy Carter who did the rollout. This Comprehensive Educational Training Act, for those of us who were in school in the early 70s, we had an Arab oil embargo and a recession, and it was kind of dicey economically. So the government said, well, let's roll out a training program so people who have a really minuscule chance of finding a job in their profession can be retrained. So consequently, all of the actors of my generation who'd just gotten out of school said, wow, that means I have the tap shoes, and perhaps an arts council or another venue, they would have the barn. Right. So I approached the Arts Council I was living in Huntsville, Alabama, a rocket city at the time, and we came up with a CETA grant for 6 professionals to start a year-round professional rep company in Alabama. That company is still in existence. Oh, wow. It merged with the Children's Theater there, and a lot of people got their start because of this government program. It's now called Theater Huntsville. Our staff photographer, our volunteer staff photographer at Twickenham Rep was this wonderful gentleman by the name of Sandy Scalco, God rest him, who was an aerospace engineer, as everyone is kind of an aerospace engineer in Huntsville, Alabama. And he not only took the most marvelous photographs of our rehearsals and our productions, but he was kind of one of our tribe. He came to me one day and he said, Kim, can you do me a favor at work? And I said, Sandy, I'd be delighted. And so we went to his office at a company called SCI, which is no longer in existence. It was bought out ages ago. And he took me to a boardroom and he said, could you say these bits of vocabulary into the tape recorder? And it turned out that the pipes digitized beautifully. Voices had not been digitized before. Here's an overview. At this time, we were trying to get to Mars. We were also rolling out an entire new generation of fighter planes. with all of this sophisticated equipment, you're going to have a system malfunction every 2.5 hours, they determined.
Oh my gosh.
They also determined planes in combat situations, the pilot reaction time would be too slow to continue on with idiot lights or cockpit lights as a warning system. The last sense that leaves you is your aural sense, your hearing. And as all the pilots of that time were men, they determined that in order to get a pilot's attention, immediate attention, a woman's voice would be theoretically perfect for this.
Oh.
Girlfriend, wife, mother, whatever.
Right.
That would get the pilot's immediate attention because the reaction time then would be immediate.
Mm-hmm.
If a pilot took the voice's command and did it, his chances would be greatly increased of saving his life. At the same time as these planes were being rolled out, we were trying to get to Mars. We had the Mars mission on the books. Funding is always a problem in going into outer space. So NASA was, in essence, piggybacking, dovetailing productions of a voice recognition system, VRS, for the satellites they were about to deploy, CombatACE, the communication system from here, from the Earth to Mars. So at the time, the feeling was, okay, I'm a pilot, I'm going to Mars. I hop in my cockpit, I turn on the ignition. The computer would say, well, hi there, Bill. How are you today? Did you have a nice cup of coffee? I know you take it black. All the personality factors of the pilots would be in the computer. So you'd have this friendly artificial voice, but imperative, talking you through not only monitoring your vehicle status, but also uplink along the way to the communication satellites, the ComSats, so you could have communication with Houston, Vandenberg, the whole 9 yards. Computer would recognize pilot or mission commander's voice, would answer in my voice, and we could pay for that by dovetailing the technology along with the F-15, F-16, F-18, Harriers, AV-8B, and all of those systems rolling out. So that was the general atmosphere, and that's kind of how my voice became the first to be digitized.
Oh.
Pure luck, but I was very proud that I was using my degree because mom and dad, had to sacrifice, of course, to get to college and to be an actor. It was like, oh no, why can't you do comedy?
Right.
Have something that, you might earn a living. So that, in essence, was the beginning of the voice acting.
So what were some of the challenges you and your team encountered during the project, and how are those challenges overcome?
Now, being basically a Girl Scout, if something was top secret, it's top secret, the confidentiality. So I took that very seriously. I also took very seriously the concept that the voice could be the last thing someone hears. So the emotional quality of the call-outs, plus matching pitch parameters for duplication and making sure everything synced up properly. We took that very, very seriously. And we also took it very seriously that we do not tell anyone what we say, because that would also put our pilots in jeopardy, or our astronauts in jeopardy.
Mm-hmm.
Continuing on with my career, trying to hit on all bases of voice acting, film acting, theater acting, whatever would fire at any point to keep me a working actor. I could not tell anyone that I was Bitchin' Betty. I could not use it as a credit. First of all, no one knew what a digitized voice was anyway. We were still in the analog concepts, recording reel to reel.
Oh.
We would record in several studios around Huntsville and Muscle Shoals. And the Muscle Shoals studio was phenomenal. I mean, there'd be peanut shells on the floor, and these guys had what I call dog ears. They could cut tape cleaner than we can edit digitally. I mean, they were just the best at what they did. And I remember Bitchin' Betty's vocabulary would change according to military tactics. There would be new things that the plane and the pilots were trained to do. For example, after the Falklands, new maneuvers. So we'd go in and do pickups Or if we were rolling out a new aircraft, there would be new aircraft capabilities that would require commands. One time going in for a pickup, Barbra Streisand had just left the studio. She had been down there cutting every note of an album just perfectly. So we were kind of like doing this secret mission to A, help get to Mars and help human civilization as we know it, and B, keep our pilots safe and our country safe. There are several times when that has a certain gravitas, kind of blows through your heart. During military campaigns, and if we lose a plane or a space shuttle, you know you've done the best you can to keep everyone safe, but
Of course, right.
it's out of your control. But I feel, and I'm sure Leslie Shook does as well.
Right.
Who took over when McDonnell Douglas, MacDac, and Martin Marietta, they kind of were bought out by Boeing, and new generations of planes were coming in, and they couldn't upgrade the technology of those voice tapes. I believe you told me that in Leslie's interview that she would listen to tapes of how I did the call-outs.
Right.
That sounds about right. The parameters had already been, the T's had been crossed, the I's had been dotted. In a stage role, actors always look up who did it first and see if they, how they discover for a present performance. It would give us our own ideas, but we could in essence replicate someone else doing a role. It's always about the work. There's nothing involved with the ego.
Right.
It's always about the work and making sure the pilots, the heads up, do something. It's always about the work. I was thrilled that even without knowing what was going on with being Bitch and Betty and how that was evolving out, that I could be of assistance to her. I'm glad. I'm very glad, because it's good work. Back to the original project and the challenges involved with that. The thing that I think surprised me the most, I wasn't surprised by the intensity of the work.
Right.
Because as a professional actor, I had a lot of endurance. I was used to working very hard, very concentrated for hours and hours. What surprised me, so being on mic for all that time, knowing that through the grace of God, the mic was always friendly to me, which is simply a gift.
Yeah, that is.
What surprised me was having to hit certain pitches. There are certain frequencies of the sine wave, like light is a wave, so is sound. I remember my dad, the rocket engineer, saying, okay, let's go outside, and we have a flashlight. We would point it at the moon, and he would say, okay, that those waves that you're creating with your flashlight will hit the moon and bounce back to Earth.
Oh, wow.
And I thought that was phenomenal. Those waves have certain parameters. So in the cockpit with hearing, some of those commands have to be at a certain pitch to lift over, carry over engine noises. And maybe it's because of the way we're wired.
Right.
If, for example, if you're going to see a monster movie, a scary movie, and there'll be a point where the structure of the film, all of a sudden, boom, everyone screams. I have a feeling a scream is at a certain frequency that will always get a human being's attention because of our physiognomy. So hitting certain pitch points, that surprised me about it.
Now, did the engineers request those pitch points?
Yes, the engineers requested those pitch points in directing me. I would also have to ask what some of these phrases meant. Then there's a certain moment of gravitas there where you realize, okay, that means this, and it's an emergency, it's a critical situation, so keep your wits about you, but do it now. You don't have that kind of gravity, I guess, unless you're a brain surgeon, certainly not as an actor, that you simply have to get it right, do it right the first time. There may not be a second time.
You talked about the secrecy of the project. Do you know how or when your voice became known as Bitch and Betty?
During the first test of digitizing my voice and seeing if the commands would work, you had the project engineer running out on the tarmac as the test pilot was there. And engineers, I love engineers because they figure out practical solutions to every problem. My vision of an aerospace engineer, they always have pocket protectors. I love that. Because if you think of the manned factors, and several of my family were involved with manned factors for the Apollo flights and the Gemini flights way early on, you can hear husband-wife scenario. Wife, honey, you've got ink all over your shirt pocket again. How many times have I told you I can't get these stains out? What, do you think we're made out of money? I have to buy you new shirts all the time. And after about the 10th time husband hears this, he says, well, what if I, and he'll do it on a cocktail napkin or any little piece of paper. Okay, let me see if I can do a pocket protector that I can slide in my pocket, so when I put my pens in there, they're not going to ruin my shirts. There is that kind of aspect of, how do we make this work physically? That's in every bit of engineering. That's why I love engineers. Getting back to the first test flight and the birth of Bitchin' Betty. So the project engineer runs out on the tarmac and says, what do you think? What do you think? It turns out that when the first chip was digitized, there was a malfunction in the imprint. And so there was a slight burble, and there was also a command that kept repeating and repeating and repeating. It did not sync up with Command A should sound like this, press A button. It would be Command B over and over and over. Engineer once again rolls out and said, what do you think? What do you think? And the test pilot said, oh, it's sweet, but that Bitchin' Betty. Now, I always thought it was Bitchin' Betty. Don't forget, back then it was like Beach Boys surfing, and bitchin' was way cool. It took me literally 20, 30 years until I see it spelled out in like Wikipedia or something like Bitching Betty. And it's like, no. Yeah, there is the over and over part of it, but it was like pilots loved Betty. They loved Betty. The first time they tried to use a different voice, the pilots voted them all down. So that's not Betty.
Oh, wow.
And for a long time, and I don't know if that's still true in this reincarnation of the aircraft, there were one or two commands that were my commands. It was a lower voice. Then one of the gals who came along in one of the aircraft. And that imprint, that double bloop bloop imprint on the early chip was kept because of the request of the pilots. It was kept because they said it sounded like Bitchin' Betty was crying, that it was a sob, a catch in the throat.
Speaking of replacing Bitchin' Betty, since there have been several replacements over the years, what are some of the things that separate you and the other pioneers from the new Bettys?
A lot of the new baby gals doing this, say for runway system safety. We old dogs have the gravitas. Some of the younger gals, for my taste, are a bit flip, a bit casual. And that may have something to do with the constant upward inflection that is prevalent in our conversational English today. In fact, it's called upspeak, where the inflection at the end of a sentence goes up instead of down, which makes everything kind of sound like a question rather than a statement. And it also sounds casual, like you don't know what you're saying or meaning, which might be fine for everyday conversation vernacular, but it makes no sense to my ears, my opinion only, in critical implementation stages of flight.
So we have the name Bitchin' Betty or Bitching Betty, depending on which version you like. If you could nickname the voice of the aircraft, what would you have called it?
If I could nickname the voice of the aircraft, I would nickname it Bitchin' Betty. I would probably spell it Bitchen.
Oh.
But no, it's such a fabulous name. Someone told me at one point there was someone kind of in World War II who had that name. But it does have a resonance of the names that go before of these, the feminine element communicators. Of course, on the negative side, for us, you had Tokyo Rose.
Right.
There's something in our mythos, in our myth, our collective country's mythos, that Bitchin' Betty is wonderful.
Because your voice is featured in the cockpits for various aircraft and even spacecraft, do pilots recognize your voice and say, hey, you're Bitchin' Betty?
Occasionally, if it's a context, if I'm in a public context that people would even start thinking, well, have I heard your voice before? I've heard your voice before a lot, but with pilots, the context would have to be more at an airfield, or if they were actual flyers themselves, military flyers. One thing that happens inevitably, if I'm doing like a something in public and invited to talk about what it's like being an actor, a voice actor, and all of this, there will inevitably be one or two guys hanging back from the crowd. When you see people hanging back after you've finished a presentation or your guest spot or whatever it may be, you know that they're hoping that they can speak to you. Thanks, you did a good job on tonight's show or whatever. And these will inevitably be pilots. These, great faces, rocky faces, like cowboys. And they'll have tears streaming down their faces.
Oh.
And I will just hug them and say, how did we spend our time together?
Oh.
Meaning, do you want to talk about a really scary time with Bitchin' Betty? That hits the hole in the soul that the wind blows through, the common humanity. Also having had the great pleasure and privilege to entertain the troops at Christmas, in my long blonde hair, Gwyneth Paltrow days, for AFPEO, Special Services 7th Army. I just thought that's what every actor does. I just thought how we spend Christmas is entertaining the troops.
Of course, yes.
And I'm just starting to get an inkling of how special that is. It was a blast. We had a wonderful time doing all this. And lucky enough that the phone keeps ringing, and I'm very busy on mic, on stage, on film, teaching. So I think I'm about the luckiest person alive. And I just know on some level, my parents are just so relieved I was able to use my degree. It's like, oh my God, 4 years at a private school. And England, it's like, oh Lord, how will she ever work? But I'm very proud of being Bitchin' Betty.
How has being Bitchin' Betty impacted your life, as well as your career?
It's an odd feeling, because for the longest time, for decades, I couldn't tell anyone I was, and if I did, no one knew what that was. And then when refrigerators talk, your cars talk, everything starts talking, there's no connection with, well, someone had to be the first one. The place where it touches my heart, and it's not something I've ever used for marketing myself. After 9/11 simmered down, I would say that, yes, I was the original, and that's all I said, because you tell the truth. You always tell the truth. But the special feeling in your heart, and now Fly Girls, you have a connection with them, even if it's just to inspire the new people doing the call-outs. There has to be a first for something, and I'm the first. I'm lucky. But I remember starting out in voice acting in Atlanta after coming from Huntsville. Our grant for the theater had ended, along with my first marriage, and it was time to get to a major market and do something else. Creating my first voice demos. There weren't women in the business. There simply weren't women in the business. It was a boys' club. And engineering was totally separate from voice acting. Occasionally you would hear of a woman announcer, but only occasionally. And announcing is a special skill. It's not voice acting. It's one arrow in the quiver. And I knew I wanted to do more of this. I couldn't tell anybody who I was. So it was like, okay, so I'm going to pull copy out of magazines because it's in public domain. And I am going to go around and meet audio engineers and see where there's some chemistry, because I knew it was an expensive proposition, and my parents always said, hire the best people you can. Always hire people who are much better at what they do than you do.
Right.
And I met one of those great engineers in Atlanta, like the engineers in Muscle Shoals, who introduced me to the concept of good, fast, cheap. Pick two. If you want it good and cheap, it's going to take longer. If you want it good and fast, it's going to be expensive. I opted for good and cheap on my voiceover demo, and I showed him, well, here's what I've done. I've recorded with my cassette recorder. Okay, there's the technology then. Here are the scripts I've pulled. Here are my reads. I've been working with a tape recorder because there was no internet. There wasn't any Google. And I wanted to show him that I'd been working and I was dead serious about this. So we did it late at night so that the rates were cheaper, and it took a long time to do. But then I had tools to take around to all the production houses and say, okay, I'm a voiceover gal. And through the years, we voiceover artists, we're a funny bunch because you really don't have to wear makeup to do voiceover. You don't have to worry about wardrobe to do voiceover. And so it's very relaxing as opposed to any other stage call or film call. Film, you have to dress as the character would dress. Stage, you just have to look good and you look like you don't need a job. But voiceover, there would be one streak where I would be being hired because Kathleen Turner had a very high profile at that time, and she very, very sexy, sensual read. So I would do that. But the clients, if the clients were ever there, they're expecting someone who looks like Kathleen Turner, and here I come with a baseball cap on because we had to stay out of the sun, and they think, oh no, oh my God, we've made this horrible choice. How are we ever going to get the read we want for this cosmetic? Within 3 takes, they have it, and it blows their mind because the voice at that point didn't look like it sounded. So that's voice acting, and that's kind of fun. Anytime you work, you feel lucky and privileged to do what we do, especially for real deal for pilots and astronauts.
You sort of touched on this, but just to clarify, I guess. So, looking back on everything you've done, how do you view being the first woman to have her voice digitized? And is it still a big thing, or is it just another job well done?
It is a big thing to be the first. It's a big thing. Once again, lucky. Right place, right skill set, right everything, because it's continuing. And now it's a genre. Now it's a genre of these voice identification system, CAUSE. We have 4-letter acronyms for what I started. And toasters that talk. It's more of a very private satisfaction of, I did the gig, I did it well. Any good work has some hint of permanence or immortality, even if it's, say, stage work, even if it lives only in memory. Took it as far as I could take it, and other people are carrying it forward. Very proud and privileged. Happy to have done it.
If you could do a prank on some pilots with the audible warning system, of course, it would be in a simulator to make sure it was safe. Is there a cartoon character or a person that you would like to use to prank them?
First of all, I'd keep Bitchin' Betty because she's iconic. I don't know where these things ended up, but always when we had a session, as engineers and talent are wont to do, there would be funny things I would say, an outtake. I don't know where they ever ended up. It might have been just from one engineer to another. And I'll clean up the language on this because Sir Tyrone Guthrie said it best. An actor is someone who wears a cape, drinks too much, and uses incredibly bad language. So one of the early Bitchin' Betty things that I was asked to do as, quote, an outtake was, bingo, fuel, kiss your butt goodbye. Bingo means you're out of fuel. And there were others. Take me to Miami. Take me to Miami. You know, fun stuff. So way ahead of the prankster curve. This was happening in the late 70s, early 80s.
Do you have any final thoughts that you would like to share?
Thank you for being interested in the history of these incredible machines and the people who fly them. I appreciate what you're doing. Once again, thank you so much, and over and out.
Thank you, Miss Crow, for taking the time to tell us your amazing story. To our viewers out there, we'd like to thank you for spending this time with us today. If you're interested in more interviews by CombatACE, feel free to visit our website, CombatACE.com, or check out more of our videos. Thank you for your time. I'm Anastasia Lee, signing off.